Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through time, where we gently step into the past, allowing the soft rhythm of history to guide us into a peaceful state of reflection. As you settle in, imagine yourself on a quiet, peaceful evening, perhaps wrapped in the warmth of your blanket or lying comfortably in bed. The quiet hum of the present fades away as we turn our gaze back to a distant past, where the first settlers arrived in the Americas. The air is cold, the land vast and untouched. Yet life began here, not with sudden leaps, but with quiet, measured steps. As these early people adapted to a harsh and unfamiliar world, as we explore their story, we'll uncover not only the challenges they faced, but also the rich tapestry of their lives, their resilience, and the deep connection they felt with the land. This story is not one of drama or high tension, but of patience and survival. Let the history unfold slowly, calmly, and imagine yourself walking beside them through this unhurried journey where every moment is a whisper, a fleeting glimpse of a world long past. Now, we begin with the first steps they took. Picture yourself in their shoes, walking across a frozen landscape, the weight of survival pressing down with each step. Imagine the vastness of the land, the stillness of the air, and the quiet determination of those who first arrived in the Americas. Segment 1. Daily Life. Immersion. Imagine, if you will, a landscape stretching endlessly before you, the land coated in a thick blanket of snow, the cold so intense that the air feels solid against your skin. The first settlers of the Americas, though few in number, were not daunted by the overwhelming vastness of this land. Their world was one of constant motion, not out of choice, but necessity. These were not people who could settle in one place for long. Instead, their lives were dictated by the rhythms of the wild, by the animals they followed and hunted for survival. The days began early, long before the sun's first light could touch the horizon. The air would be sharp with the scent of frost, the earth hard and unyielding beneath their feet. In the quiet of morning, the first settlers would have prepared for another day of survival, their breath visible in the cold air as they huddled together, trying to preserve what warmth they could. They relied on each other, and it was the sense of shared responsibility that bound them, a collective effort where every person had a role to play. The task of hunting, always the cornerstone of their survival, was not undertaken lightly. The animals they sought were formidable and swift, and tracking them required a deep understanding of the land. Every footprint in the snow, every rustle in the underbrush, was a potential sign of game. They moved in unison, communicating through gestures and soft-spoken words, their movements measured and purposeful. At night, after the hunt, the settlers would gather around their fire, the warmth from the flames offering a brief respite from the chill of the world around them. The crackling of the fire would be one of the few sounds breaking the silence of the wilderness. Here, they would eat, their meals simple, often nothing more than the game they had caught, perhaps supplemented by whatever they had managed to forage during the day. The shelters they built were not luxurious, nor were they meant to be. Constructed from the materials they had at hand, wood, stone, and animal skins, they offered just enough protection to survive the night. Each shelter was a small, carefully constructed haven, designed to shield them from the biting cold and the unpredictable elements. While their days were filled with the constant need to provide for the group, there were moments of quiet amidst the chaos. These were the moments when the settlers would rest, their bodies weary from the constant demands of survival. Yet, even in these moments, their senses were attuned to the environment around them. The soft murmur of the wind through the trees, the distant call of a bird, or the subtle rustling of the earth beneath them, all held meaning. The life of these early settlers was one of endurance. Their world was shaped by the seasons, by the ever-changing demands of nature. Yet, through it all, they remained adaptable, their lives a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As you listen, imagine yourself alongside them, feeling the weight of the cold and the weight of their determination. Now, gently, let's transition into a deeper exploration of their story, as we move from the rhythms of daily life to the figures who would leave their mark on this land, shaping the very course of history. As the first settlers of the Americas continued their journey across the vast, frigid landscape, they began to shape their environment in ways that have left us with tantalizing glimpses into their culture. These early peoples viewed the land not merely as a resource to be exploited, but as something sacred, an integral part of their very existence. The mysteries surrounding their spiritual beliefs and practices are not only fascinating, but also provide a window into how they perceive their world and their place within it. Imagine then the stillness of the land around you, the cold, sharp air, the endless stretches of snow, and the jagged rocks that rose up like ancient sentinels. The settlers, despite the harshness of their environment, saw something in this landscape that we can scarcely begin to understand. For them, the land was alive with meaning, filled with forces and spirits that needed to be respected and honored. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the earliest human inhabitants of the Americas engaged in rituals that were deeply tied to their connection with the natural world. These rituals, though shrouded in mystery, are believed to have been performed at specific sites that were considered sacred. These sacred spaces were often located in places of natural beauty or spiritual significance, on the banks of rivers, atop hills that offered panoramic views of the land, or near caves that seemed to echo with the voices of the past. One of the most intriguing aspects of these sacred landscapes is the presence of large stone formations, sometimes arranged in elaborate patterns. Archaeologists have long speculated about their purpose. Were they places of worship, where the first settlers offered prayers or sacrifices to the spirits of the land? Or were they more practical, designed for astronomical observations or seasonal rituals? The truth remains elusive, but these sites, which still dot the landscape today, stand as silent witnesses to the lives of the first settlers. These early people believed that the world around them was imbued with spirit and meaning, and the act of creating sacred spaces was one of honoring that spirit. The mounds, the stone circles, and the carvings found in these areas suggest a deep reverence for the land and its power. Perhaps these were places where the settlers came together to mark important events, seasons, migrations, or rites of passage. There is evidence that some of these sacred sites were used for burial, further underscoring the importance of these spaces in their spiritual lives. Imagine standing in one of these sacred spaces. The wind is still, and the earth beneath your feet feels ancient, as though it holds the memories of countless generations. The stone structures rise around you, silent but imposing, their purpose hidden from our understanding. Perhaps you can almost hear the whispers of the past, carried on the breeze, telling the stories of those who came before. In addition to their physical manifestations of spirituality, the early settlers also had a deep connection to the animals that roamed the land. Many of their beliefs centered around animal spirits, and they viewed certain creatures as embodying the forces of nature itself. The bear, the wolf, the eagle, all were considered sacred beings, and the settlers often carried out rituals to honor these animals. It is believed that they saw themselves as stewards of the animals, with a responsibility to maintain the balance between human needs and the natural world. As we explore these sacred landscapes, it becomes clear that the early settlers of the Americas were not simply struggling to survive. They were creating a culture, a worldview that was intricately tied to the land around them. Their beliefs were a reflection of the harshness of their environment, but also of their reverence for the natural world and its mysterious forces. Now, as we transition from these mysterious and sacred spaces, we turn our attention to another fascinating aspect of their lives, their social organization. How did these early people organize themselves into communities? And what roles did the individuals within these groups play? The answers are not entirely clear, but as we will see, their social structures were just as innovative and adaptive as their methods of survival. As the first settlers continued their journey across the harsh landscape, they did more than simply survive. They began to form intricate social structures. Despite the challenges they faced, they found ways to organize themselves into communities that were both functional and resilient. The social dynamics of these early people were shaped by necessity, but over time, they began to develop deeper, more complex relationships with one another. From these interactions arose the foundation of what would become the cultural and societal norms that guided their lives. Imagine the first settlers forming groups based on kinship, their lives intertwined with a common goal: survival. In these early communities, every member had a role to play, and the success of the group was dependent on the contributions of each individual. There were hunters, gatherers, and caretakers, all working in unison to ensure the continued well-being of the group. Even the smallest task was vital, and there was a profound sense of interdependence. The rhythm of their lives was set by the seasons, by the animals they hunted, and by the need to constantly adapt to their environment. Social hierarchy, however, was not as rigid as we might expect. There was no singular elite ruling over the others, at least not in the way we think of it today. Instead, leadership emerged from the necessity of survival. The strongest hunters, the wisest elders, or those with the most knowledge of the land were often looked to for guidance. Leadership was more fluid, based on merit and respect, rather than inheritance or wealth. Yet even in these egalitarian structures, there were distinctions. Some individuals or families might have been better equipped to survive the harsh conditions, perhaps because of superior hunting skills, access to better tools, or a greater understanding of the land. These distinctions, while not oppressive in the modern sense, would have created a subtle division in daily life. It's easy to imagine how, over time, some individuals or families might have gained more influence than others simply by virtue of their survival skills. However, even those who held positions of influence did not live in comfort. Their lives, like those of everyone else, were deeply shaped by the constant struggle for survival. Whether they were leaders or hunters, they still had to contend with the same challenges: the cold, the hunger, and the dangers of the land. The idea of luxury, as we understand it today, was non-existent. Instead, wealth was measured by what one could provide for the group, and the true value of an individual was determined by their ability to contribute to the survival of the collective. The first settlers lived in a world where their daily lives were a constant balance of struggle and cooperation. Their homes were modest, their meals simple, and their time was consumed with the effort to secure food, shelter, and safety. But despite these hardships, they managed to create bonds that went beyond mere survival. The shared experience of living in such a challenging environment fostered a deep sense of community. This was not a society defined by wealth or power, but by mutual respect and the understanding that each person played an essential role in the survival of the group. As we reflect on their social structures, it becomes clear that the lives of these early settlers were both humble and profound. They were not defined by their possessions nor by titles or status. Instead, they were defined by their ability to adapt, to survive, and to live in harmony with one another and the land they called home. Now, as we move from this contemplation of their daily lives and social structures, we turn our attention to the lasting legacy left by these first settlers. Their story is not one of great conquests or dramatic battles, but of quiet resilience. Their influence can still be seen today in the very landscapes they once inhabited, in the tools they crafted, and in the spiritual beliefs they passed down. As we close this segment, take a moment to reflect on how their lives, though long gone, continue to shape the world we live in today. Imagine the scene as the first settlers of the Americas prepared for another long, cold night. The sun, barely a trace on the horizon, had long since vanished, leaving only a deep, inky darkness. The temperature had dropped sharply, the cold so biting that it seemed to permeate everything, skin, bone, and thought alike. In this vast, unforgiving land, shelter and clothing were not mere comforts, but essential tools of survival. These early settlers, having crossed vast frozen landscapes, knew that the environment would not be kind to them. They learned to craft clothing and build shelters that could withstand the elements, ensuring they could endure the harsh winters and unpredictable weather. The clothing they wore was made from the very animals they hunted, skillfully crafted to protect against the biting cold and the dangers of the wild. Picture yourself now, wrapped in animal skins, your breath clouding in the freezing air as you prepare for the night. The skins, tanned and softened through hours of work, would have been sewn together with bone needles, every stitch a necessary action to create a garment that would keep you alive. These early settlers understood that their survival depended not just on the hunt, but on their ability to adapt their environment to their needs. Their clothing, while simple, was a testament to their resourcefulness, each piece an integral part of their survival strategy. The shelters they constructed were equally practical, designed for maximum protection from the cold and the elements. These were not the grand, permanent homes we might think of today, but small mobile structures that could be assembled quickly and efficiently. Some would have been made from wood, while others used the materials at hand, stone, animal hides, and grasses. The shelters were built low to the ground, with thick walls that would help retain the warmth of the fire inside. The roofs, often steeply pitched, were designed to shed the heavy snow that could fall without warning. Imagine the feeling of being inside one of these shelters. The air inside is warmer than the frozen world outside, but still filled with the faint, smoky scent of a fire. The walls of the shelter, made from skins and wood, create a small, intimate space where the group could gather together for warmth and comfort. In the center, a fire burns gently, casting flickering shadows across the walls and providing the only source of light. The warmth from the fire, though modest, is a lifeline against the chill of the night. In moments like these, the small shelter becomes a sanctuary, a place of respite where the rhythm of life continues, even in the heart of the wilderness. Despite the harshness of their environment, these settlers were not without ingenuity. They crafted tools not only for survival, but for the comfort and practicality of their daily lives. A bone knife, fashioned with expert precision, could cut through animal hides, allowing for the creation of both clothing and shelter. The needles made of bone, though simple in design, were essential for stitching together the materials they had. Every tool, every piece of clothing, every shelter was a result of countless hours of trial and error, of lessons learned through the relentless demands of nature. The simplicity of their clothing and shelter stands in stark contrast to the complexity of their lives. Despite the limitations of their materials and the harshness of their surroundings, the settlers were able to craft a life that allowed them not only to survive, but to adapt. The clothing they wore and the shelter they built were not just physical necessities. They were expressions of their resilience, their deep connection to the land, and their ability to live in harmony with the world around them. As we reflect on the lives of these early settlers, it becomes clear that their ingenuity was not just about survival. It was about making a life in the midst of adversity. Their clothing and shelter were symbols of their resourcefulness, their understanding of the land, and their ability to create something lasting and meaningful from the simplest of materials. Now, as we gently move forward, let us explore the tools that enabled these early settlers to continue their journey, a set of implements crafted with care, each one a testament to their survival and adaptability in the face of the unknown. These tools, though simple, would prove to be essential in shaping the way they navigated the wild, allowing them to carve out a life in the vast, untamed expanse of the Americas. As the first settlers of the Americas made their way through the harsh, frozen landscape, survival depended on more than just strength and endurance. It relied on the tools they crafted, the implements they used to shape the world around them, and the innovations they made to adapt to the challenges of their environment. Imagine, if you will, standing in the middle of a vast, snow-covered wilderness. The wind howls around you, the chill in the air biting at your skin. Yet, in the quiet moments of this stark world, there is a profound understanding that the tools you hold in your hand are not just objects, but lifelines. The tools of survival were not crafted in a moment of luxury. Every item, every implement was carefully fashioned from the resources that the land provided. Bone, stone, wood, and antler. All were shaped and honed into tools that would serve a specific purpose. Every tool told a story of survival, a knife to cut through animal hides, an axe to fell trees for shelter, a scraper to prepare food or build a fire. These tools were not just useful, they were essential. Imagine the process of crafting these tools. The first settlers would have spent hours, perhaps days, shaping stone into a cutting edge with careful precision, chipping away at the rock with smaller stones or bone tools. Each strike was measured, each chip a step toward creating something that would sustain them through the next phase of their journey. The stones, once rough and jagged, would slowly take on the form of a knife, sharp and purposeful, ready to cut through the hide of a mammoth or a bison. Bone was another vital material, used for everything from needles to fish hooks to arrowheads. The bone was carefully carved, sometimes smoothed to perfection with sand or stone, to create tools that were both durable and effective. A bone needle, for example, was essential for stitching together the animal skins that would form the clothing and shelter needed to survive in such a brutal environment. The same bone needle could be used to repair tools or create new ones, a small yet indispensable part of the survival toolkit. Stone, too, played a crucial role. The settlers learned to use the materials at their disposal, picking up rocks from the ground and shaping them into tools with remarkable ingenuity. There were hand axes for chopping wood, scrapers for removing fat from hides, and pounding stones for grinding grains or other plant materials. Every piece had its place, every tool its purpose in the delicate balance of survival. As you reflect on these tools, it's impossible not to feel the weight of the knowledge required to craft them. These were not mass-produced items, but hand-carved, individualized tools born from necessity and refined through experience. The settlers did not have the luxury of time, but in their limited moments of stillness, they carefully honed their skills, passing down the knowledge of tool-making to future generations. In many ways, these tools were extensions of the settlers themselves, part of their identity as survivors. They weren't just objects to be used. They were a reflection of the settlers' deep understanding of the natural world. Every knife, every arrowhead, every needle was a direct response to the challenges they faced. These tools allowed them to adapt to the ever-changing conditions of the land, and they were the very means by which they could secure food, shelter, and safety. The significance of these tools, however, went beyond their practical use. They were symbols of the settlers' ingenuity and their ability to create something lasting from the simplest materials. In a world where the forces of nature were often uncontrollable, these tools offered a sense of agency, a way to shape the environment to their needs. The settlers were not passive recipients of the world around them. They were active participants, carving out their place in the wilderness through their skill and resourcefulness. Now, as we move forward, we begin to see the evolution of these early settlers' lives, marked by a subtle but profound shift in their relationship with the land. Slowly, over time, the practice of hunting and gathering would give way to the development of agriculture. This shift, gradual yet transformative, would reshape their way of life in ways that would reverberate through history. But for now, let us reflect on the tools that allowed these early settlers to endure, and marvel at their ability to survive and adapt in a world that was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. As the first settlers began to carve out a life in the Americas, one of the most profound changes in their way of life slowly took root. Over time, the practice of hunting and gathering, which had sustained them for generations, began to give way to something entirely new, a shift in how they interacted with the land. This change, subtle but transformative, marked the dawn of agriculture in early societies. But what did this shift look like? Was it a sudden transformation, or a slow and steady adaptation to the land that they had come to know so well? Imagine for a moment that you are one of these early settlers. After seasons of following animal herds across the frozen tundra, hunting them for food and shelter, something within the group begins to shift. The land, once purely a place of hunting and survival, starts to be viewed differently. The settlers begin to notice patterns in nature, the way plants grow, how the seasons change, and how certain areas of the land consistently produce food. Over time, they begin to understand that the land can offer more than just wild animals to hunt. It can offer the potential for sustenance in a new form, and thus, the seed of agriculture is planted. The transition to agriculture, while not immediate, slowly began to change the settlers' relationship with the land. Initially, they likely began by gathering and planting seeds from the wild plants they had foraged, paying careful attention to which plants grew best and in which conditions. These early settlers didn't have the tools or knowledge we associate with modern farming. They didn't have plows, irrigation systems, or organized fields. Instead, they worked with what they had, planting in small plots of land near their campsites or shelters. The process was likely slow and experimental. Perhaps they planted a small crop, only to find that the soil was too cold, or the seasons too short for the plants to thrive. Or perhaps they learned which plants could withstand the freezing temperatures, surviving the long winters, and providing food when other sources were scarce. Over time, these small experiments would have yielded more consistent results, and the settlers began to build a rudimentary understanding of farming and planting. This gradual shift toward agriculture didn't mean an immediate abandonment of hunting and gathering. Instead, it was an integration of both lifestyles. The early settlers continued to hunt and gather, but now they also grew small crops, using their newfound knowledge of the land to cultivate food in a way they hadn't before. This newfound food source, root vegetables, berries, and eventually grains, provided them with a level of stability they had never known. It was no longer just the hunt that determined their survival. Now, they could begin to rely on crops that would grow year after year. Imagine now the growing sense of security that would have come with this new practice. The settlers would have seen their communities begin to thrive in ways they hadn't before. The crops, though modest in size, were a constant source of food, supplementing the meat they hunted and the resources they gathered from the land. Agriculture was no longer just an experiment, it was becoming a way of life, deeply rooted in their daily rhythms. This transition marked a profound change in the way the settlers interacted with the environment. They began to see the land not only as a space to survive in, but as something that could be shaped and cultivated to sustain them over the long term. For the first time, they could imagine a life where the hunt wasn't the sole means of survival, where their food sources could be more predictable, less dependent on the vagaries of the wild. As we reflect on this shift, it becomes clear that the dawn of agriculture was not just a change in diet, it was a change in mindset. The settlers, once at the mercy of the land and its seasons, had begun to take control of their environment. Their adaptation was not just a physical one, it was a mental and cultural shift that would lay the foundation for future societies. Now, as we move forward, we turn our attention to the sacred spaces they created, the places where the settlers felt a deep connection to the land, not just for survival, but for something greater. These sacred landscapes weren't just about practicality. They were the emotional heart of their communities, where spiritual practices and beliefs intertwined with the everyday struggle to survive. Let's take a closer look at these places and explore what they might have meant to the early settlers, both as a physical space and as a spiritual one. As the first settlers in the Americas adapted to their environment and began to shape the land to suit their needs, they also developed a profound relationship with the natural world that went beyond mere survival. For these early people, the land was not simply a backdrop for their daily struggle. It was imbued with meaning, a place of spiritual significance. Over time, they created sacred spaces, areas where the physical and the spiritual worlds intersected, and where their beliefs were expressed through rituals, ceremonies, and symbolic gestures. These landscapes, carefully chosen and intentionally shaped, offer us a glimpse into the deep reverence they held for the world around them. Imagine walking across the vast expanse of the land, feeling the crunch of frost underfoot, the quiet stillness of the wilderness surrounding you. As you move through this silent world, you come upon an area that seems different from the rest. Perhaps it is a hill that rises just slightly above the surrounding terrain, offering a commanding view of the land. Or maybe it is near a river, where the sound of the water rushing over rocks creates a rhythmic, almost hypnotic melody. These sacred spaces were not randomly chosen. They were intentionally selected for their beauty, their seclusion, or their connection to the natural elements, places that seem to carry a deeper meaning. These sacred landscapes were places where the settlers could connect with the spiritual forces they believed governed their world. The first settlers had a deep spiritual connection to the land, viewing it as a living, breathing entity that required respect and reverence. The earth was not simply a resource to be used, it was something to be honored and protected. In these sacred spaces, the settlers could perform rituals to ensure good hunting, successful harvests, or protection from the dangers of the wild. They believed that by honoring the land and its spirits, they could ensure the well-being of their community and the continuation of their way of life. At some of these sacred sites, archaeologists have discovered large stone structures, mounds, and circles, suggesting that the settlers used these places for ceremonial purposes. These could have been locations where the settlers gathered to perform rituals, to honor the spirits of the animals they hunted, or to celebrate the changing of the seasons. The construction of these structures would have required a significant amount of time and effort, indicating their importance to the people who built them. The mounds and earthworks found in some regions may have served as burial sites for important individuals or as symbols of the cycle of life and death. These were not mere places of rest. They were imbued with spiritual significance. To bury someone in a sacred space was to honor their journey, and the mound itself may have been a way of ensuring that the spirit of the deceased remained connected to the land and its power. The act of creating such monumental structures, from the smallest stone circle to the largest burial mound, would have been a deeply spiritual act, a way of expressing the settlers' connection to the land, the animals, and the forces that govern their world. As you imagine these sacred spaces, it's easy to picture how they would have been a place of solace and reflection, a place where the harshness of the world could momentarily fade away. Standing in a sacred space, surrounded by the natural beauty of the land, the settlers would have felt a sense of unity with the world around them. The land was not a hostile place to be conquered, but a living force to be respected and honored. In these spaces, they could leave behind the struggles of survival and connect with something greater than themselves. Now, as we shift our focus from these sacred landscapes to the social structures that held these communities together, we begin to see how the first settlers not only lived in harmony with the land, but also with one another. The formation of tribes, clans, and communities would bring new complexities to their way of life. Social roles, leadership, and cooperation would become central to their survival and success. Let's explore how these early societies were organized, and how the roles and relationships within these groups shaped their world. As the first settlers of the Americas continued to adapt to their environment, the next step in their evolution was the formation of organized social structures. Life in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness required more than just survival skills. It demanded cooperation, trust, and a shared sense of responsibility. Over time, the first settlers began to form social groups that were more than just family units or bands of hunters. These communities would grow into tribes, clans, and even more complex forms of social organization, each tailored to the unique demands of their environment. Imagine yourself once again in the midst of this wilderness, the wind howling in the distance as the soft crunch of snow echoes beneath your feet. Around you, the members of your group go about their daily tasks. Some hunt, some gather. Others work on maintaining the shelter or crafting tools. These groups were far from chaotic or disorganized. In fact, they were incredibly structured in their own way. The first settlers, although living in a world that might seem disconnected from our modern understanding of society, developed systems that allowed them to survive and thrive in their environment. At the core of these early communities was the family. It was within the family unit that the foundations of society were laid. Each individual had a role, and every action had a purpose. The parents, grandparents, and children all worked together in harmony, each contributing to the well-being of the group. The elders, who had accumulated the wisdom of many seasons, were respected and often looked to for guidance. Their knowledge of the land, the animals, and survival techniques was invaluable, and their leadership in times of uncertainty was crucial. But as these small, family-based groups grew in size, so too did the complexity of their social structure. While the early settlers may not have had formal systems of governance like we understand today, they still developed methods for decision-making and leadership. The most skilled hunters, the wisest elders, and those with the greatest knowledge of the land often assumed leadership roles. These leaders were not kings or chiefs in the traditional sense, but respected figures who earned their position through their ability to contribute to the group's survival. The early social structures were built on cooperation and mutual respect, rather than on the accumulation of power or wealth. While some individuals may have had more influence than others, the needs of the community were always at the forefront. There was no concept of luxury or excess. Instead, the focus was on ensuring that everyone had enough to eat, shelter from the cold, and protection from the dangers of the wilderness. Social roles within these groups were often determined by the specific skills that an individual possessed. The hunters, with their sharp eyes and steady hands, were the providers of food, while the gatherers collected berries, roots, and other plant materials. Those with knowledge of the land and the weather became the spiritual leaders or healers, offering their wisdom to guide the group through times of uncertainty. In this way, social organization was fluid, with roles often overlapping and shifting depending on the circumstances. The development of these early social structures also marked the beginning of more complex forms of communication. While much of the early communication would have been through gestures, body language, and simple vocalizations, the growing complexity of these communities likely led to the development of more refined languages and rituals. The settlers would have passed down stories, traditions, and knowledge through oral storytelling, creating a shared history and identity that would bind the community together. As these groups formed into more cohesive tribes or clans, the need for cooperation and coordination became even more essential. The challenges of the environment were great: disease, predation, harsh winters, and the constant struggle for food. Yet, through these social structures, the first settlers were able to create a sense of stability and continuity. They were able to share resources, make collective decisions, and support one another in ways that allowed their societies to endure, even in the most difficult of times. Imagine, then, the daily life of these early communities. The social bonds formed through shared tasks, mutual respect, and the constant need for survival were the bedrock of their existence. It was a life that required cooperation, understanding, and trust. In this world, each person played a vital role, and the well-being of the group was more important than individual ambition. As we transition from these early social structures to the next phase of their development, we turn our attention to the interactions between different groups. Early encounters with other tribes or settlers could lead to both conflict and exchange, as different ways of life came into contact. Let's now explore how these early settlers encountered each other, and how these interactions shaped their culture and survival strategies. As the first settlers of the Americas continued to adapt and thrive in their new environment, they did not remain isolated. Over time, they encountered other groups, some of whom were similarly traveling across the land, while others were already established in their own territories. These early interactions, whether through conflict or exchange, would shape the trajectory of the first settlers' lives in ways that are still debated by historians today. The clash of cultures, the meeting of different groups with varying traditions, survival strategies, and worldviews had a profound impact on the early settlers and their way of life. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a forest, looking out over the horizon. In the distance, you see a group of travelers, their figures outlined against the setting sun. These are not people from your community, and they are not the people you know. They are strangers, and the encounter you are about to have could shape the course of your life. Will this meeting be one of exchange, where knowledge and resources are shared? Or will it be a conflict, a battle for territory, resources, or survival? The early settlers, like many groups throughout history, were not living in isolation. As they expanded across the land, they inevitably came into contact with other people, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. The interactions between these groups were complex and varied, shaped by the needs and desires of each. Some encounters may have been marked by cooperation, as different groups traded goods, shared knowledge of the land, or formed alliances for mutual benefit. These exchanges could have been life-saving, providing access to new tools, food sources, or survival techniques that the first settlers had not yet discovered. But not all encounters were peaceful. As in any society, competition for resources, especially in a landscape as unforgiving as the one the settlers inhabited, was inevitable. Hunting grounds, riverways, and fertile land were all valuable resources, and different groups had their own ideas of how these should be used. Tensions could arise over land, food, or other vital needs. In these moments, conflict could erupt, as each group sought to protect its own survival and way of life. Imagine the intensity of these moments, when two groups, each with their own survival strategies and cultures, came face to face. The air would be thick with tension as each side evaluated the other, unsure whether the encounter would lead to cooperation or violence. It wasn't just a battle of physical strength. It was a battle of survival strategies. The first settlers were experts at navigating the wild, with their knowledge of the land and its resources. But the other group may have had its own set of skills, different tools, different hunting methods, or different ways of managing food. In such a confrontation, both groups would be keenly aware of how important their knowledge and resources were to their continued survival. Yet, despite the potential for conflict, these early encounters also offered opportunities for growth. When the settlers and other groups did engage in peaceful exchanges, they were not just trading goods, they were exchanging knowledge. Each group brought with it its own set of skills, traditions, and innovations. The first settlers learned from their encounters, whether it was a new method of hunting, a new tool, or a new way of interpreting the land. These exchanges helped them refine their survival techniques and adapt to the environment in new ways. The clash of cultures, then, was not just a story of conflict. It was also a story of learning, adaptation, and change. Over time, the first settlers incorporated aspects of other groups' practices into their own way of life, creating a more complex and diverse society. This cultural exchange, while sometimes fraught with tension, ultimately played a role in shaping the settlers' development and their ability to thrive in an ever-changing world. As we move on from this exploration of cultural clashes, we now turn our attention to another mystery that continues to fascinate archaeologists and historians: the mysterious mounds left behind by some of these early peoples. What purpose did they serve? Were they purely ceremonial, or did they have a more practical function? These mounds are not just physical landmarks. They are symbols of a culture whose story is still unfolding. Let's now delve into the enigma of the mounds and explore the theories that have emerged about their meaning and purpose. Across the landscape of North America, scattered in various regions, are large earthen mounds, mysterious structures that continue to captivate archaeologists, historians, and anyone curious about the ancient past. These mounds, which can be found in places ranging from the Mississippi Valley to the Ohio River Valley and beyond, stand as silent witnesses to a culture that has long since disappeared. But what were these mounds for? Were they simply burial sites, or did they serve a more complex, symbolic purpose? The mystery surrounding these structures continues to intrigue those who study the early settlers of the Americas. Imagine, for a moment, standing before one of these towering mounds. The earth beneath your feet feels solid, ancient, as if it holds the weight of centuries of history. The mound rises before you, its contours shaped by hands long gone. The surrounding landscape is quiet, the air still, and yet the mound itself seems to pulse with a sense of purpose, as though it carries meaning beyond what we can understand today. Archaeologists have found that many of these mounds were used as burial sites. Some of the earliest settlers, as well as later cultures, used them to bury their dead, perhaps as part of a spiritual or ceremonial ritual. The mounds, often massive in size, were sometimes built with great care, with layers of earth and stone meticulously arranged to form a structure that would endure for millennia. The dead were not just buried in the ground, they were placed in these mounds, which may have been seen as a way of ensuring that the spirit of the deceased would remain connected to the land and the community. The size and complexity of these mounds suggest that the builders of these structures had a deep spiritual connection to the land and to the idea of life after death. The mounds were not simple heaps of earth. They were carefully constructed, sometimes with multiple layers of soil, stones, and even wood. This suggests that the act of building the mound was just as important as the burial itself. For the early settlers, the mound may have been a sacred space, a place where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds were blurred. But the mounds were not merely places for the dead. Some of the most famous mounds, like those found at Cahokia in Illinois, appear to have had a ceremonial or ritualistic function as well. The mounds at Cahokia, for example, are arranged in a specific pattern, with the largest mound, known as Monk's Mound, rising higher than any other. This massive earthwork, which could have been used for ceremonial events or perhaps as a platform for the chief or spiritual leader, demonstrates the importance of the mound as a focal point for social and spiritual activities. The placement of the mounds and the rituals performed around them might have been tied to seasonal changes, the movements of celestial bodies, or significant events in the lives of the settlers. The fact that these mounds were often constructed with such precision suggests that the people who built them had a sophisticated understanding of engineering and geometry. They would have needed to calculate how much earth and stone were required to create a stable structure, and how to layer the materials in a way that would ensure the mound's longevity. These early builders did not have the advanced tools or technology that we have today. Yet their ability to create such enduring structures speaks to their ingenuity and knowledge of their environment. Some archaeologists believe that these mounds may have also served as a way of marking territorial boundaries or acting as symbols of power. The construction of large monumental mounds could have been a way for groups to demonstrate their strength and influence, asserting control over a particular area. These mounds may have been visible markers of a tribe's or clan's presence, providing both spiritual and practical functions. Yet, despite all the research and theories, the true purpose of these mounds remains elusive. We can only speculate about their precise meaning, and even more so about the rituals and ceremonies that might have taken place there. What we do know, however, is that the mounds were central to the cultures that built them. They were places where people came together, not just to honor the dead, but to celebrate life, mark important events, and connect with the land in ways that were deeply spiritual. Now, as we leave the mystery of the mounds behind, we shift our focus to the beliefs that shaped the lives of the first settlers in a different way. These early peoples had a profound connection to the animals they hunted, not just for survival, but in a spiritual sense. Their belief in animal spirits and the role these animals played in their rituals offers us further insight into how the settlers saw themselves within the larger web of life. Let's explore their animal spirit beliefs and how these deeply held convictions influence their survival, their rituals, and their understanding of the world. The first settlers of the Americas, much like many ancient cultures, held a deep and profound connection to the animals with whom they shared the land. This connection was not just one of utility, it was spiritual, woven into the very fabric of their existence. The animals were seen as powerful beings, imbued with spirits that could guide, protect, and influence the lives of the people who lived alongside them. The belief in animal spirits was central to the early settlers' worldview, shaping their rituals, their hunting practices, and even their interactions with other humans. Imagine yourself walking through the dense forest, the soft rustle of leaves underfoot, the faint scent of pine in the cool morning air. You pause, listening intently as the wind stirs the branches above you. You've been hunting all day, but today feels different. There is a presence in the air, a sense of something watching, something guiding your every move. In the silence of the forest, the animals are never far away. They are more than mere creatures of flesh and bone. They are spirits, connected to the land in ways that humans can barely comprehend. For the early settlers, the animals were not just resources to be hunted. They were sacred beings, each with its own unique spirit. Bears, wolves, and bison, among others, were often seen as powerful animal spirits, revered for their strength, intelligence, and survival instincts. These animals were viewed as more than just food or tools. They were believed to carry the wisdom of the natural world. To hunt an animal was not simply a matter of killing for sustenance. It was an act of respect and reciprocity. The settlers believed that they had to honor the animal's spirit in order to receive its gifts, whether that was food, clothing, or tools made from the animal's body. This reverence for animals was often expressed through rituals and ceremonies. Before a hunt, the settlers would likely perform a ritual to honor the spirit of the animal they were about to hunt. These rituals might include offerings, prayers, or dances, all designed to show respect for the animal and to ensure that the hunt would be successful. The settlers believed that the spirits of the animals were closely tied to the land, and that if they did not show proper respect, the animals might refuse to share their spirit with them. These beliefs created a delicate balance between survival and spirituality, where the act of taking life was always tempered by the understanding that it was a gift to be respected. But the animal spirits weren't just invoked in times of need, they were also integral to the settlers' worldview and their understanding of the forces of nature. The early settlers viewed the natural world as a complex web of interconnected beings, with animals at the center of this web. Every animal had its own role to play in the larger ecosystem, and the settlers believed that by understanding these roles, they could better navigate the challenges of their environment. The movements of animals, their behavior, and even the sounds they made were interpreted as signs, omens that could provide guidance on everything from the weather to the success of a hunt. For example, the appearance of a certain animal might be seen as a sign of upcoming change or as a warning of danger. The migration patterns of birds, the behavior of wolves, or the movement of fish in a river were all watched closely, as they were thought to hold messages from the spirit world. This belief system created a deep sense of connection to the environment, as the settlers saw themselves not as masters of the land, but as a part of it, tied to it through the animals they relied on for survival. The animal spirit beliefs also shaped the settlers' art and storytelling. Many of their stories were centered around animals, with creatures like bears and wolves taking on significant roles in myths and legends. These stories often carried moral lessons, teaching the young ones about the importance of respecting the natural world and understanding their place within it. The settlers' artwork, too, reflected this reverence for animals with intricate carvings, paintings, and symbols depicting the animals they honored. These images served not only as expressions of respect, but as a way of keeping the spirits of the animals alive in their daily lives. As we move from these deeply spiritual beliefs to the practical realities of daily life, it's important to consider how these ideas influence the roles of women within the early settler communities. While much of the focus in traditional histories has been on the men, those who hunted and fought, women played an equally essential role in the survival and development of these communities. Their contributions were crucial, shaping the social and cultural fabric of the groups they lived with. Let's now turn our attention to the role of women in these early societies and explore how their influence, though often overlooked, was instrumental in ensuring the continued survival of their people. In many societies, including those of the early settlers in the Americas, women held roles that were critical to the community's survival and well-being. While much of the historical narrative tends to focus on the men, those who hunted, fought, and led, women played an equally, if not more, essential role in sustaining life. Their contributions were not limited to one area, but were integral to the daily functioning of their societies, from gathering food to child rearing to decision-making within the group. As you think back to those early communities, imagine the balance between the men who ventured out into the wild and the women who maintained the heart of the camp, tending to both the physical and spiritual needs of the group. Picture a small settlement in the wilderness, nestled between towering trees or beside a gently flowing river. The men may be out hunting, tracking bison or mammoths across the frigid landscape, but the women are no less busy. Some are gathering berries, roots, and plants from the surrounding area, carefully selecting those that are safe to eat, while others may be preparing food, skinning animals, or working on clothing. Women were the primary gatherers, relying on their intimate knowledge of the land and its seasons to provide a consistent food supply. Without them, the group would not have been able to sustain itself through the long winters or times of scarcity. The skill and knowledge required to gather food was immense. Women would have known which plants had medicinal properties, which were edible, and which could be used for other purposes, such as creating tools or dyes. Their understanding of the landscape was profound, and they were often the first to notice changes in the environment, whether that was the arrival of a particular plant or the shift in animal behavior. In this way, women contributed not only to the immediate survival of the community, but to the long-term sustainability of their way of life. But the role of women was not confined solely to gathering. Women were also deeply involved in the social and cultural life of their communities. In many early settler societies, women played key roles in maintaining the social fabric. They were responsible for teaching the younger generations, passing down knowledge of the land, the traditions, and the rituals that defined their people. Women often held important positions within the community, serving as healers, spiritual leaders, or advisors, with a deep understanding of the spiritual beliefs that connected the group to the land. Women's influence was also felt in decision-making processes. While many early societies were likely led by men, it is clear that women played an essential part in guiding their communities through challenges. In some cases, women were responsible for the governance of the group, acting as advisors to the leaders or even taking on leadership roles themselves. Their decisions were often based on a deep understanding of the community's needs, ensuring that resources were shared fairly, that the children were cared for, and that the group was prepared for the coming seasons. Consider how a woman in this society might balance the practical aspects of survival with the deeper spiritual and emotional responsibilities she held. She might be tasked with preparing food for the group, ensuring that everyone is well fed and ready for the coming journey. but she would also be expected to pass on the teachings of their ancestors to ensure that the young ones understood the importance of the animal spirits, the sacredness of the land, and the rhythms of nature that govern their lives. In this way, women were not just caregivers or gatherers, they were the bearers of culture and tradition, ensuring that the values of their people were preserved for future generations. Despite the crucial role women played in these early societies, their contributions have often been overlooked or undervalued in traditional historical accounts. The focus on male-dominated activities like hunting or warfare has sometimes overshadowed the equally vital roles that women played in maintaining the social and cultural stability of their communities. Yet, as we reflect on the balance of responsibilities in these early societies, it becomes clear that without women, the survival of the group would have been impossible. Now, as we shift our focus from the essential role of women to another aspect of early life, we delve into the networks of trade that existed between different groups of settlers. These early people did not only survive, they connected, exchanged goods, knowledge, and ideas with distant communities. These early trade routes not only allowed the settlers to acquire resources they couldn't find in their own territories, but they also fostered cultural exchange that would shape their societies. Let's explore the early trade networks that helped these groups thrive and adapt, allowing them to connect across vast distances and build relationships with distant peoples. As the early settlers of the Americas adapted to their environment and began to form complex societies, they realized that survival didn't rely solely on the immediate resources around them. The land provided, but it also had its limitations. To truly thrive, they had to look beyond their immediate surroundings and engage with other groups, trading goods, ideas, and resources across vast distances. These early trade networks, though often informal and localized, allowed different groups to share the wealth of their lands and knowledge, creating a web of connections that spanned far beyond what we might initially imagine. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a river, watching as a small canoe approaches, its occupants navigating the water with skill and ease. As the canoe draws closer, you notice that it's not just carrying people, it's also carrying goods. Baskets, tools, pelts, and food items are carefully arranged inside, evidence of a trade taking place. The people in the canoe are not from your immediate group. They come from a distant community, perhaps miles away. You and the other members of your group have been waiting for this exchange. In return for the fish, hides, and tools you've provided, you will receive something just as valuable: stone tools, shells, or perhaps medicinal plants that are not found in your area. These trade routes, though rudimentary by today's standards, were essential for the survival of early societies. The goods that were exchanged were crucial for day-to-day life. Items that the settlers couldn't find locally, or that were in short supply. Stone, for instance, was an essential resource for tool making, and groups that lived in areas where stone was abundant could trade it with those who lived in regions where it was scarce. Similarly, materials like shells, copper, or salt were highly prized and exchanged over long distances. But trade wasn't just about material goods. It was also about exchanging knowledge and culture. The early settlers were constantly learning from one another about the land, about survival techniques, about spiritual beliefs. Each community had its own unique practices and ideas, and through trade, these could be shared. A group from the north, for example, might have developed advanced techniques for preserving food in the freezing temperatures of winter, while a group from the south might have mastered the art of navigating the dense forests or deserts. By trading goods and ideas, these groups ensured that they were not only surviving, but growing in knowledge and adaptability. Trade networks also played a role in the social and political dynamics of the early settlers. The exchange of goods often led to the formation of alliances between different groups. These alliances could offer protection, foster cooperation, and help ensure mutual survival in the face of common threats, whether they were environmental, such as a harsh winter, or external, such as hostile groups. Trade also served as a means of reinforcing social bonds and reinforcing status within and between communities. A group that controlled a valuable resource, such as salt or copper, could gain influence over other groups who would rely on them for access to these essential materials. As you think about the early trade networks, it's important to understand that these exchanges weren't just about trade itself. They were about relationships. The people involved in these trade networks weren't just strangers who met at a neutral point to exchange goods. They were part of a larger system of mutual dependence and cooperation. The success of these early trade routes was built on trust, reciprocity, and a shared understanding of the value of what was being exchanged. The relationships that were built through trade were as important as the goods themselves, and the flow of goods became a symbol of the interconnectedness of the early settlers' societies. Now, as we transition from the exchange of goods and knowledge to the environmental challenges that these early settlers faced, we must recognize that their survival was not just dependent on their ability to trade or adapt culturally. It was also deeply influenced by the ever-changing environment. From the Ice Age to the rise of new predators and changing climates, the environment presented constant challenges. These challenges shaped the settlers' lifestyles, forcing them to continuously adapt in ways that would ultimately define their societies. Let's now explore the environmental challenges the first settlers faced and how they learned to navigate the complexities of the land. The first settlers of the Americas lived in a world that was constantly changing. From the icy winds of the Ice Age to the shifting patterns of climate and the unpredictable presence of new predators, their environment was both a provider and a challenge. The early settlers, like all humans, were not immune to the whims of nature. They had to learn to adapt to the land, to understand its rhythms, and to make the most of what it offered them, while simultaneously preparing for the harsh realities it could present. Imagine yourself standing on the edge of a vast tundra, the cold biting at your face as the wind howls across the open landscape. The sky is a pale gray, and the land stretches endlessly in all directions. The world you know is one of extremes, scorching summers and bone-chilling winters, storms that can arrive without warning, and an ever-present need to be prepared for the worst. In this world, survival is not guaranteed. It requires constant vigilance, adaptability, and resilience. For the first settlers, the changing climate presented a series of challenges. During the Ice Age, they would have faced cold temperatures that made survival difficult. The glaciers that covered much of North America forced the settlers to adapt in ways that required ingenuity. They learned to fashion clothing and shelter that could withstand the brutal cold, using animal skins and other natural materials to protect themselves from the elements. The harsh winters, with their biting winds and deep snows, would have required constant adaptation to ensure the group's survival. In these times, the ability to work together as a community, sharing food, resources, and knowledge, would have been essential. But the environment was not only cold. The settlers also had to contend with a fluctuating climate. As the Ice Age began to recede, the warming temperatures brought their own set of challenges. As the glaciers retreated, the land began to change, and new ecosystems emerged. The settlers, who had once hunted large game like mammoths and mastodons, had to shift their hunting strategies as these animals disappeared. They adapted by hunting smaller game and fishing, learning to exploit new resources as the environment evolved. At the same time, new predators began to appear. The early settlers were not the only ones vying for resources. They had to share the land with wolves, bears, and other dangerous animals. While many of these predators were an important part of the ecosystem, they posed a significant threat to the settlers. The settlers had to learn how to protect their camps and families from these dangers, either by fortifying their shelters or by developing new hunting and defensive strategies. The unpredictable nature of the environment also meant that the settlers had to be prepared for the unexpected. A sudden storm could destroy shelters, ruin food stores, or make hunting dangerous. A drought could reduce the availability of water and food. Floods could wash away entire villages. In these times, the early settlers' reliance on each other would have been paramount. They had to share knowledge of the land, its weather patterns, its resources, and its dangers in order to prepare for the next challenge. The changing environment also forced the first settlers to adapt in ways that were not just practical, but spiritual. Their deep connection to the land and the animals that lived on it shaped their beliefs and rituals. They believed that the land itself had a spirit, that it was alive and ever-changing, and that their survival depended on respecting these forces. The rituals they performed, the sacred spaces they created, and their reverence for the animal spirits were all part of an ongoing attempt to live in harmony with the land, to understand its rhythms, and to ensure that they would be able to survive the next great challenge it presented. Despite these many challenges, the first settlers were incredibly resilient. Over generations, they developed the skills, tools, and knowledge necessary to thrive in an ever-changing world. They learned how to make use of every part of the animals they hunted, how to create clothing and shelter that could protect them from the elements, and how to navigate the land and weather. Their survival was a testament to their ability to adapt, to learn from the past, and to pass down that knowledge to future generations. Now, as we come to the end of our exploration into the lives of the first settlers, it's clear that their legacy is one of resilience, innovation, and deep respect for the land. Their survival in the face of such formidable challenges is a story of human determination, ingenuity, and connection to the natural world. While much of their history remains shrouded in mystery, the influence of the first settlers can still be felt today. Their knowledge, their cultural practices, and their ability to adapt to an ever-changing environment laid the foundation for the societies that would follow. As we reflect on this journey through time, it's important to recognize that, much like the first settlers, we too face challenges in our own world. Challenges that require resilience, adaptability, and a deep respect for the environment around us. The lessons of the past are not just stories to be told. They are reminders of the strength we all carry within us, and the importance of living in harmony with the world around us. As we near the end of our journey through the lives of the first settlers of the Americas, it is only fitting that we pause to consider their lasting legacy. These early settlers, who navigated vast and daunting landscapes, overcame unimaginable challenges, and formed societies from scratch, left an indelible mark on the Americas. Their innovations, cultural practices, and way of life laid the foundation for the world we know today. Yet the true extent of their influence on modern society is still a topic of debate among historians. Imagine yourself, once again, on the vast expanse of the land they once roamed. The terrain may have changed over millennia, but there are echoes of the first settlers everywhere, in the land, in the animals, and in the traditions that still shape life across the Americas. Their legacy is not always visible in grand monuments or written records, but it is present in the ways we live, the foods we eat, and even in the rhythms of the seasons that guide us. The first settlers were remarkable in their ability to adapt to their environment, creating tools, shelters, and survival strategies that allowed them to thrive in one of the harshest and most unpredictable regions on Earth. From their ingenuity, we inherited many practical skills: the use of animal skins for warmth, the creation of efficient tools from stone and bone, and the understanding of seasonal changes that still inform agricultural practices today. Many of these practices, while ancient, remain relevant in some of the most remote and rural parts of the Americas, where traditional methods are still passed down from generation to generation. Moreover, their agricultural innovations paved the way for the development of settled communities. While the first settlers were initially nomadic, their eventual shift toward agriculture laid the groundwork for the rise of more complex societies. The domestication of plants like maize, squash, and beans, and their integration into the diets of millions remains one of their most enduring contributions. Today, these crops are staples in many diets around the world, from the Americas to Europe and beyond. The cultivation techniques they developed, such as companion planting and irrigation, are still practiced by modern farmers. In addition to practical innovations, the spiritual beliefs and cultural practices of the first settlers continue to resonate. Their deep connection to the land and to animal spirits was not merely a survival strategy, but a worldview, a way of seeing themselves as part of a larger, interconnected natural world. These beliefs, rooted in respect for nature, continue to influence indigenous cultures across the Americas today. The idea that the land itself holds sacred power, and that humans must live in harmony with nature, is a lesson that has gained new relevance in the modern world, as environmental concerns become ever more pressing. The social structures they established also left a lasting imprint. The formation of clans and tribes, with their emphasis on cooperation and shared responsibility, provided a model for many communities, both indigenous and non-indigenous, across the Americas. In particular, the importance of women in early societies, whether as gatherers, spiritual leaders, or decision-makers, has influenced gender roles and the understanding of women's contributions in many cultures today. The notion of social equality, rooted in the need for collective survival, still echoes in movements for justice and equality in modern societies. Yet, despite all of these contributions, the first settlers' legacy is not always as clear-cut as we might imagine. Historians continue to debate just how much influence they had on the subsequent cultures that arose in the Americas. Some argue that the legacy of these early settlers was diluted or erased by the arrival of European colonizers, whose societies often displaced indigenous ways of life. Others believe that the influence of the first settlers endures in more subtle ways, through language, customs, and even genetics. The story of the first Americans is one of continuity and adaptation, a thread that runs through time and space, weaving its way into the fabric of modern life.